Hello.
Hello there.
So what were you just doing, you said?
You've caught me in the middle of immersion in medieval Scottish poetry about the plague, about the COVID. So this is Robert Henryson, in prayer for the pest. O eternally God, O power infinite, O quois his knowledge, nothing is obscure, that is, or was, or evil shall be perfect. So it goes on, and then there's this wonderful one here. William Dunbar in 1505, approximately, Lament for the Markers, Lament for the Poets, in which he's talking about all the poets knocked down by various plagues, and he has this constant refrain. And the reason I'm looking at this, Jonathan, is that I was meant to be doing Thought for the Day this week on Wednesday, but they contacted me and said, could I swap to Monday, which means I prepare it tomorrow on Radio Scotland.
Okay.
And then they got wind, they heard through the grapevine that I had COVID. So I got a panic phone call saying, are you still good for doing it, or are you dying? And I said, no, I think I'm okay. I'm just trying to decide what to do it on. And they said, well, if you've got COVID, how about that?
Right. Well, of course. And as you know, I have too. So this is all the more reason to hear the poems, I guess.
All the more reason. So, basically Dunbar starts off, I that in heel and was glad, I that in heel was and gladness, I that in health was and gladness, am troubled now with great sickness, and feeblet with infirmity, timor mortis conturbat me, which apparently, according to this academic paper I found from a woman who did a first degree at Aberdeen and is now in New Zealand, Karen Gillings, who is an expert on medieval disease in Scotland. This article being called Fear of Disease in Medieval Scotland. According to her, that refrain means, where did I put it? The fear of death unsettles me. Timor mortis conturbat me. Would you say Timor or Timor? Do you have Latin?
In Scots, I'm not sure. I mean, I say timorous when I'm speaking normally.
Yeah, but this is Latin.
Yeah, well, there you go. So I don't know. Timor, Timor, I don't know.
I might or might not end up quoting it. And so it goes on. You're unto the death gods all estates, princes, prelates, and protestatis, Protestants presumably, both rich and poor of all degree, timor mortis conturbat me. And then he names all the great men. They're entirely men of the previous century who succumbed to plagues in this long liturgical poem of death. Hey.
So you've been spared.
That is my introduction to saying welcome to the Whisky Club, Jonathan.
Thank you.
How are you doing? Are you surviving? I'm on beer at the moment, incidentally. I might move to the stronger medication lately.
Well, I have the whiskey at hand if we could get there. I'm all right. Like you, I've been spared. I like that line, the Hebridean, if we're spared line. I was indeed spared. I feel like I've got quite a lot of activity going on in my throat, but I'm otherwise functional. The early phase was quite strong, where I was sleeping for about 48 hours. And I'm still infectious, which is why I'm sequestered up in this bedroom. And I haven't seen my wife and kids properly for a good week now. So it's just because we're trying to keep them free of because I wasn't infectious apparently when I got home, and then I got to the room and crashed out, and that's when I heard from you that you had it, and I heard from other people that they had it, and so I thought chances are it will happen, so let's just stay here. So the sad thing is I've been stuck. The good news is I've been well looked after and had unusual amount of time to myself, which has been good.
That's no bad thing. I almost wonder if, what are the effects of things. I've noticed it with flus before. It's almost as if it presses a kind of reset button, as if it defragments the hard disk. Excuse me, I'm just going to make occasional notes because I still don't know what I'm going to write
So
for
that's
this
fine.
thought
If
for
I can
the
help
day.
you write your
And,
thought for the day, it'd be a great pleasure.
Defrag the hard disk, themes like that. Because at the end of the day, I've got to come up with about 320 words, 2 minutes of radio.
I know I've seen them on Twitter because you get them on one page exactly, which is always with footnotes sometimes.
And basically, they've got to tie in something in current affairs. So my peg is that Jason Leach, the COVID SAR in Scotland, has just come down with it. And it's on the increase in Scotland just now. In fact, it may be that the reason obviously I won't name the context where I likely caught it in the broadcast, but it may be that the reason why it's going so strong in the south of England just now, they are speculating because the incident has nearly doubled in the past week in the south of England, is that they're reckoning it's all the platinum jubilee parties people were having.
Right.
Which is interesting. So it may be, your event bounced off the platinum jubilee, and whereas that's been a total non-event in Scotland, it may be that there were people who'd had more exposure than previously. There, and of course even if they do the test before arrival, which I would imagine the anti-vaxxer type would turn a blind eye to. Even if they do, as you know, getting the test to prove positive is quite something.
That's true. I think,
I think you have to scrub pretty hard.
It's not just to scrub pretty hard. It's that the LFT test is a public health test, not a personal test. In other words, what the question the LFT test is asking is this person a risk to public health, i.e., are they infectious? The question is not, does he have COVID latently or potentially at that point? And so until it is actually positive and you're infectious, you don't have confirmation. So the way someone put it to me is, whereas a positive COVID test is a red light, in other words, stop, you have it. A negative LFT test is not a green light. It doesn't mean go. So I don't know what the percentages are there, but a good chunk of people who have it will not test positive, of course. So I must have had it, I think, from the Realisation Festival. I was in bed for 2 days and only then I tested positive.
Before the Perspectiva Festival? Yeah,
so at the Realisation Festival that we recently met at, I was with you and you tested positive soon after leaving, and I was with 3 others who tested positive soon after leaving. And then I knew it was almost inevitable I would get it, but at that point I was still testing negative. So it just goes to show really. But anyway, health. What is health for, after all? Like, what is that? That's the question.
Well, to raise it, I think, to raise it.
That's right, we raise health. Yeah. So, well, I got this Jura. You said it was Whisky Club. It's a pretty basic Jura. It's off the shelf at Sainsbury's. I got it for emergency whiskies. And I haven't opened it yet, so this is a good moment to open it when you're ready. You don't have to go there just yet.
Well, yes. I can. I can make preparations so that you can fulfill the formalities at your end.
Okay. So, so just to let people who don't know or not aware of this know, there was a.
Are we doing an interview? Are we doing?
We're just having a chat, really.
Now?
No, we're just having a chat, but I'm just giving a bit of context in case. In case we end up putting it online, in which case.
Well, you're welcome to do so. Look, I'm on the Auchentoshan.
Yeah, well, I told you I'm on the Jura.
It's quite interesting. This is I've got. If you're doing an interview, I should bring out one of the fancy ones. This is a bog standard. Notice the industrial livery.
Oh yes.
This is a Glasgow whiskey. And Veren and I were walking up the Kilpatrick Hills, and you look down on the Auchentoshan distillery.
Right.
And I was chuckling, saying, I wonder how many people think it's up some Highland Glen and not realizing it's on the edge of Glasgow, pretty much.
Right.
And I was looking at the massive area of bonded warehouses. and saying to Venera, I don't understand why they don't have those roofs covered with solar panels. You know, it's a perfect area for solar panels.
Right.
And I remarked to her, you know, I've never actually tried that whiskey. So later on, I was in a supermarket and I saw it on special.
Right.
So I got a bottle on special, and it's actually rather nice. They claim that their distinguishing feature is being triple distilled.
Triple distilled. That's like the triple.
It does actually make for a very smooth one.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember, but Donald Trump, when he was in the place that he believed that God entitled him to,
right.
Recommended drinking disinfectant at one stage. And,
and
I think what people are forgetting is that, much to our embarrassment, his mother's from the Isle of Lewis.
True,
so when he spoke of drinking disinfectant, he was possibly thinking of something
I see.
Not unlike this, you see. So I'm following the Donald's advice on this single issue matter.
Charitable.
Well, slancher,
indeed. Good that we were spared.
If you use it for any purpose to all our fellow travelers, and
indeed,
whatever your particular disinfectant might be, which might not be of the ilk, but
indeed. But it's funny you mentioned Auchentoshan, because when I've obviously taken the sleeper up and down to London and Scotland many times over the years, and I believe they have a handful of whiskies, but the most expensive one from memory is the Auchentoshan.
No,
that's my memory on the train.
They're probably pricing it according to romanticism of the sound.
Yeah, that's what I wonder. Yeah, I need to maybe double check that. That was my memory. They have 3, including Bowmore and Auchentoshan, and that was the one that was most. It also rolls off the tongue. It's a kind of pleasure to say.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if I was being more formal about the matter, I would be using something like the As We Get It. Well, that's the one you had. You know, that's the one we had. Yeah. Jonathan.
That's great. That's the one you gave me. At the festival.
Yeah. But you know, I said it. You know, I said it varies. I mean, this one that we had is 103% proof.
Right.
And I have one more waiting somewhere. Oh God, where's it? It's hidden up the back. I can't reach it. 107. And this is really nice stuff. The Cool Island.
Yeah, that one I know.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's normal 70% proof. Or
remind me, Alistair, what 103% means, because when you texted me to say I'm coming with 103%, I was slightly terrified.
By the way, while in there, because we're down in England, just to honour this was sent to me by a friend. It's really nice stuff. Spirit of Downs English brandy.
Okay.
Spirit of the Downs English brandy, handcrafted in Sussex, aged with English oak. It's numbered bottles. This is 192 of 250. It costs about the same as a good malt whiskey.
Right.
But it's very nice stuff. In fact, Verenne bans me from it. She says it's too good for your Whisky Club. So for a French woman to be so protective of an English brandy, I mean, that is, at a time of Brexit, that is quite some achievement. So 100% proof, as distinct from volume. Oh, dear me. Excuse me, I've got everything very balanced here in a precarious position on my sofa. So let's hope I don't knock the computer over. 100% proof whiskey, which is round about 60%-ish volume, is that in the old days, if you mixed the spirit with gunpowder and set fire to it, if it was over 100% or over, there would be sufficiently little residual water left in order that the gunpowder would still burn.
I see.
But if it's below 100%, in other words, below round about 60% by volume, there's so much water that it swamps the gunpowder, and the spirit will burn off, but not the powder.
Okay, interesting.
A lovely measure. Lovely measure.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice.
In fact, Jonathan Sorry, you're entering into a state of prayer there, and I interrupted you. But Boris Johnson, if he's bringing back imperial measures, I think should bring back proof units with the insistence that they be measured using old-fashioned black gunpowder to properly
Remind people of,
authenticate. Properly
yeah,
authenticate
they'll just go all the way back to Guy Fawkes. Gosh.
You can see I've still got this cough. So sorry, you are entering in.
No, I have the same cough waiting to come out. But no, I was just curious about how things are for you about a week later. So we're now Saturday and the festival started last Thursday. And you spoke on the Friday morning, I believe.
Yeah.
And, you know, for those who weren't there, it was really quite formidable, Alistair. I mean, obviously you're known as a great speaker, and a lot of people want to hear you. You're considered very wise and knowledgeable and so forth. But I felt even by your own standards, there was something a little bit mesmerizing about the performance. And I'm just curious if you felt the same way, and if so, what you think made that possible.
Yeah, I felt it was a good one. And what I mean by that is I felt that it came over really strong. And not only that, but I felt myself carried away in it.
Right.
That I was really into flow with it. And I think that was it was a combination of things. I mean, one is that I'd been speaking, as you know, in Exeter at St. Stephen's Church, courtesy of Timothy Gorringe, the divinity prof, retired there, on the Wednesday night. And I'd traveled down by train the previous day. And then I'd spent the day with some with Timothy and friends there, but a slowish pace. And I'd been in that kind of ambience. And then I met up with you folk at Salisbury and had a blether with our host Elizabeth Oldfield that afternoon. And I didn't know her beforehand. I don't think we'd met previously, but she was very good at holding the space. And I mean, virtually her first question to me was, you know, if there's one thing you'd like to talk about, what would it be? And I just sort of said, outrageously, God. But she really liked that. So it legitimized me to come in at that deep level.
Sure.
And of course, in most contexts, when you see something like that, I'd think, oh, he's off his rocker, some, you know, die-hard American fundamentalist from the Hebrides kind of thing. But I mean, you saw how I did it. You saw what I was.
What I loved about it is not just that you spoke freely about what you cared about, but the night before, when I'd given a short introduction to the festival, and I'd mentioned that I'd forgotten to say a few things, and yet nonetheless it seemed to go okay. Your line was quite striking. You said, yes, you have to, what was the exact wording now? You have to allow yourself to enter into it, you said.
Yeah.
And enter into it. Now that's quite a mystical. The it there is the spirit of the time, the moment, the kairos, whatever that is. Allow yourself to be in it. And then when I observed you the next day, I thought, oh my God, that's what he's talking about.
Yeah. Well, you see, I think you or somebody else used the term kairos, possibly in the introduction, the kind of grabbing the moment, the turning point in time. Varenne is French, and we have this joke, you know, where we will suddenly do something, and I'll say to her in my schoolboy French, c'est le moment. You know, if you don't grab that moment now.
Right.
I often think sometimes, you know, you're in those situations when you have the opportunity to help somebody who is in need or to pass them by. And you'll feel divided about it. Varenne bumped into, you know, Varenne was in an airline queue a while back, and there was a woman who was being charged excess and in a terrible state because she didn't have money or something. And Ferenc just grabbed it and did the decent thing.
Right.
And I said to her, did you give her a card to pay you back? And she said, no, I could see she really couldn't afford it. So just let it pass. But still a moment, you either grab these moments or you don't. And these are these mini kairos moments, these mini moments where you can flip reality.
Right.
And if we're talking about flipping realities, capturing such moments in the micro, and if enough of us are doing that, it builds up into a macro shift, is perhaps part of the way to go. So I kind of felt like in that context of the Realisation Festival at St. Giles House, there was a context where I could do that. There was the permission given by the way that yourself and the pre-discussion we had on Zoom, and then the discussion was Elizabeth, but also the interesting tension that I'm coming at so much of what I do through, excuse me, I'm just letting the cat up in my knee, through an applied context of land reform and much that spins out of that. And here we were with the Earl of Salisbury, no less.
Earl of Shaftesbury, but yeah.
Of Shaftesbury, I'm so sorry, I keep on muddling.
It's okay, you get off at Salisbury Station to get there, so yeah.
I'm afraid I don't really know my way around Burke's Peerage very well. The Earl of Shaftesbury, no less. And of course, you see, I checked out his background very briefly on the train. And I just, I read the family history and the double tragedies in his immediate background that led, and I just thought, poor man. On the one hand, in this position that the vast majority of people would see as enormous privilege. On the other hand, being yanked out of a life of being a disc jockey or whatever he was in America, and suddenly brought back because both his father and his brother had, within 6 months. I mean, it's almost like Sir Walter Scott's poem "Farewell to Mackenzie," where Mackenzie, the last of the Mackenzies, Deaf Mackenzie, Colonel Francis Humberstone Mackenzie, who owned the whole of the Isle of Lewis in the 1800s, and was governor of the Barbados while it was still a slave colony. He died, and his his daughter's husband, Admiral Hood, also died within a couple of moons of each other. I forget how the poem puts it so beautifully. It's just kind of almost karmic working through of destiny that gets captured by Walter Scott. And there was I had a sense from that young man, or whatever age he would be, probably about slightly just younger than us, I don't know. But I had a sense from Nick, who's our host, almost of being thrown into that position of destiny. And then what do you do with that? What do you do with it? You either run from it or you allow yourself to be totally swamped and the role takes you over. Or you are deeply, deeply challenged with what Jung called individuation, otherwise known as self-realization. Individuation in Jung's sense, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychotherapist, of becoming a true individual, of recognizing the circumstances of your life and saying, my calling is to listen for what my calling is and serve that which gives life as best I can, which is why I quoted to him Alice Walker's poem, the Black American feminist poet Alice Walker, one of her poems where she says, take the contradictions of your life to wrap around you like a shawl, to parry stones, to keep off stones and keep you warm. Take the contradictions of your life to wrap around you like a shawl, to parry stones and keep you off. And, keep you warm, I'm sorry. And, we only had about 2 3 or 4 minute interchanges during that whole weekend, but there was a profundity there, I think, born of that recognition and what that was doing and shaping up. In shaping up, sorry, I'm being sussed out by a cat here.
That's okay.
In shaking up, hey, Mabel, hey, don't knock my computer over, please. Got my computer balanced on a box, and she's very curious. What it did, Jonathan, is it introduced a creative tension, a polarity of opposites, and whenever you see that in a situation, whenever you know that you're in a situation where there's a potential difference here, there is voltage, there's something potentially explosive, that can let the deep stuff come through. And I think that is part of what was going, that although he didn't, or I presumed he didn't know it, he being in that room was part of the tension that created a sense of mischiefness. Our friend Pat Kane would say playfulness. It created that, which allowed a deep flow through, where my fundamental message I felt to communicate to people there is that in these times, each of us must discern our calling. Our calling is beyond the me, it's from beyond even the we. Our calling is listening for that vocation, that vocal thing, that thing that we hear with the inner ear, as to how we are called to serve in these times. And that's for me what was going on. And then I can't remember how the laughing started, but I think it started right at the beginning, but once that got going, it just became a hoot. It became, it almost felt like doing a comedy show. But I was talking about God. I was trying to say to people, folks, let's take this really seriously, because we are in times where we have to dig deeper than the egotistic, narcissistic, materialistic understanding of what it means to be a human being that has brought us into these times.
Right. Whew. Indeed, and it was beautifully articulated and felt.
Show you my little friend here. I don't know if you can see her.
Let me see. Hello.
And yeah.
And I also know, Alistair, that Nick was very touched by the sharing of that poem, because he, of course, shared it back to the group at the end.
Yes, I saw that. I was out then, because I knew this value was going on. It was my terrible hearing.
Yeah.
I always feel very self-conscious when I'm having to ask for my microphone to be passed around that feeds in by Bluetooth. So I just thought to myself, they're doing the evaluation thing. I'll just skip that, and I'll wander around and catch one or two people and have one-to-ones, which is what I was doing when somebody came. Olivia came and got me and said, could you come back in? And then
right, because then they turned, of course, I forget the word Elizabeth used, but it was a kind of mixture of pieces of text, creating a florium, or there was some kind of word like that. It's often used from biblical scripture, but it doesn't have to be. It can be poetry or even just lines that come from our experience.
Midrash.
And then, sorry, what's it called?
Midrash.
Not Midrash. I know that's somewhat different. Whatever it was, what then happened was that the improvisers who were part of the festival, including my namesake Jonathan, turned it into a song about the festival, and that line of poetry of Malice Walker was included in his song, which I think was recorded by somebody. So you might see it, but I think it was actually Pat Kane who recorded it. So I'll have a word with him about whether he can share that.
Well, that's just lovely. But for me, what I enjoyed about it was that event. I mean, it was such a laugh. Doing that session with Elizabeth, that hour-and-a-half session.
Sure.
It felt worthwhile doing that, and then the one-to-ones, because as you know, I tend to avoid groups of people and you're around the table saying, because I can't pick up with the hearing, I can't pick up clearly when there's any crosstalk at all.
Right.
So I was just wandering around like the daft laddie innocent, but I was actually just keeping corner of my eye open for people who might be hovering, perhaps keen to have a conversation but a bit shy.
Yeah.
And then I would just catch their eye, and I would say, so how's the conference for you then? And, you know,
Right.
in most cases, in no time, we'd be straight in the deep end,
Huh.
was where they were at in their lives and what they were seeking. You know, I'd say to many of them, that line, I wouldn't necessarily tell them where it was coming from, but that line from the Gospels where Jesus is walking along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter and Andrew start following him, and he turns around and says, "What seek ye?"
Right.
What seek ye? What are you looking for? What are you desiring, as the Jesuits have it? So I would just say to them, what you seeking, and charge questions to ask somebody that in a receptive context. You're dropping a depth charge that it
it's
can be
interesting you
very
say that,
profound.
what seek ye is fascinating to hear that now, because I hadn't made this connection. But I had a moment later in the festival when I was observing a close colleague of mine, Indra Adnan, in this context, in the anti-debate, with her microphone asking questions.
Yeah.
And then a bit earlier, another colleague of mine, Mark Vernon, with the microphone also asking questions. And I suddenly noticed them in the sense of hunters, you know, as if they were they have their own sense of what it is they have to find, and they're kind of looking for it in the questions. It was a subtle notion, but I had the feeling that most people have this kind of hunter element to them, that they're looking for something or other. I think in Indra's case, it's something about the political agency resting within the individual and trying to elicit it and bring it to life. With Mark, it's something more about the texture of the inner life and the search for God or something like that. But in both cases, you sort of sense that although they're asking something and the person's saying something, with their eyes and their ears, there's a kind of hunting going on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes, because in those situations, a facility to, again, in Jung's terms, is giving expression to the archetype, is allowing the otherwise transcendent, formless archetype to be embodied in them, to draw out something archetypal in the community.
Right.
And if that is successful, it weakens consciousness in the community.
Right.
It's quite important to understand this.
So let me try and understand it. So the archetypes, I think I understand what you mean, but when I think of archetype, I would think of things like wizard and alchemist and maybe
Tricksters
even
maybe even wise old men and women, and
right. So
shadow figures, Hitler, Pol Pot,
the fool maybe as well, the magician maybe,
the fool, and the holy fool, the wild woman, wild man, right. These deep patternings of which do I have it just now? No, I'm reading Marie von Franz on fairy tales just now. She's upstairs. But I mean, her view, this Jungian fairy tale folklorist, is that the archetype, that the fairy tale is the purest way in which you see the cultural archetypes.
Right.
The golden key.
Right.
The poison apple. Right. You see, these are archetypal dynamics. Right.
But you're saying that each person instantiates a particular archetype or seeks it or represents it? Or...
No, I wouldn't say should I say my understanding would not be that. It's more that these archetypal principles represent structures of deep reality. And that consciousness in the profound sense, and in the sense needed to be agents of change in the world at any time, consciousness expands through becoming aware of archetypal content, being able to see the world archetypally, to be able to see what is happening archetypal and where that is moving us towards, and what the opportunities and the dangers are that are embodied in that.
Mm.
Therefore, when we evoke, I'm putting it the wrong way there, when we allow ourselves to serve in a way that evokes archetypal responses in people, we waken up very deep flows of energy in them.
Allow ourselves.
And this is where, and this is where you get into classic crisis situation, of the crisis being something that is both potentially dangerous. This can drive people mad. It can be the energy that drives fascism and what have you. But it can also move people to enlightenment. You're waking up very deep things in people.
Right.
And so in a sense, in my work, the insistence upon constantly calling it back to what personally I'm happy to call God these days, and many people would prefer other terms, and different cultures have their own terms for it. Unless you keep grounding that back into the God that is a God of life, the God whose name is love. God is love, the three most important words in the Bible. Unless you keep anchoring it back into that, you're dealing with dangerous forces. Are you with me? Are you with me there?
You?
And, and yet, if you don't, if you understand those forces, but you don't engage with them, you leave the world just languishing in meaninglessness.
Right.
And to Jung, meaninglessness was the greatest disease of our times.
Mm-hmm.
What makes for meaning? What makes for meaning is spiritual connection. Is that understanding that we are all profoundly interconnected. It's love that holds the whole shebang together. But each of us has got to work it out for ourselves, in our own individuated way, individually and collectively.
Right.
Individuation does not mean individualism. Individuation means being a true individual so that you can understand your part in the collective and serve what gives life.
Right. Indeed. Well said.
Jonathan, I mean, that's kind of how it was for me. How was it for you, the Realisation 2022 weekend?
Well, I was quite pleased with it, actually. The tension you mentioned, there's lots of things that are interesting vis-a-vis your response, because I'm not a land reformer like you, but I am from Scotland, and I have my mother was a nursery teacher, my father was an art teacher, brought up for some time by my grandfather who worked on a granite quarry. So I don't claim great poverty in my background, but there is a sense of not being from the manor born. So when I first encountered St. Giles House, and I wondered what kind of world I'd sort of fallen into. Like, this was aristocracy, and I was, gosh, what is this? On the other hand, I don't want to pretend it was, too big a shock, because I also managed to get entry into Oxford when I was younger from a comprehensive school in Aberdeen.
Sure.
And then I went to Oxford for 3 years and laterally to Harvard for 1 year. So, I have spent some time in those kind of social environments where, I was initially extremely uncomfortable, but have gradually become quite familiar. And I think also on a personal level, just because of my chess background, because I achieved a lot, something individually, meritocratically, I just have a great deal of social, confidence in that sense. I never feel like I shouldn't be somewhere because I'm not worthy or anything like that. It's never really occurred to me.
No.
Anyway, the other thing is I just like Nick. I just, at a one-to-one level, I saw, like you say, an incredible personal story. So I was drawn to the drama and tragedy of that, but I also deeply admire the guy for the enormous capacity to turn his life around, fulfill the responsibility that was set before him, and build something of value for many people, and hopefully something that is more than just about sustaining itself for its own sake, but it's generative. So that was the sort of spirit underlying the festival. And as you know, the pattern that connected us was the idea of Bildung, because one of the prior earls, the third earl especially, he was one of the initiators of the idea that changes in the external world had to be somehow matched or informed by changes in the inner world.
Hugely.
And this is a major principle of the Romantic movement, of which he was part. But it's also a principle that informs some of the social history of the Nordic countries. And it's in a book called The Nordic Secret by Lena Rachel Anderson and Thomas Bjorkman. They argue, and this might be of some interest to people who are interested in Scottish independence, actually, because one of the things they argue is that the reason these countries managed to settle on a broadly egalitarian social model with high degrees of social trust is the nature of the education system that gave people the capacity to make their own meaning. But what characterized these folk Bildung schools was a kind of ability for people to make sense on their own terms. So they weren't always looking for a strong leader to do it, or looking around them only to think of what the gossip was telling them what to think. So trying to create that individuation early, the roots of it in the process of learning. So anyway, that was the shared background. And that was the pattern that connected. And then we had about 2 or 3 years, 2 years, give or take. We first of all created this interesting team. In addition to me and Nick, a close friend of his called Ed. Then of my part from Perspectiva, Pippa Evans, who's a kind of entertainer. She was the person who brought the improvisers and the singing and a lot of the vitality to the event. Mina Salami was part of the original group. She's she's a feminist. She's also Black. She speaks a lot about issues of race and gender, but she does it in a way that's different and very interested in beauty, for example, as a defining theme, and very drawn to the beauty of the place. And then also Mark Vernon, I mentioned, very interested in the soul, seeing the soul as a theme that we could explore at the festival, and imagination. And between us, that was the main set of people. We spent a long time thinking about this festival over many months. And so although when it finally happened properly, there was a couple of aborted attempts with COVID, one just online and then one much smaller festival. But by the time we finally got round to it, it's one of those things with hard work, right? It's not cause and consequence. There's something distilled in the process of the work that by the time the program was there and the people arrived, it's like, this is what we'd hoped for. And what we hoped for was a festival where people could be fully themselves. And that's, not just entertainment to come and sort of be swooned by things, but actually to feel at ease in your own kind of learning journey, to connect very deeply with people very quickly beyond the chit chat, to really speak about what matters to you in life. And then actually vis-a-vis individuation, to find yourself in that way, to sort of create a social environment where you weren't just hearing talks, but you had your small groups to actually investigate things. There was music, there was art, there was a lot of nature involved, there was improvisation and all of this. And there was a willingness to talk about really important things like God, like Madeline Bunting's talk on care, Oliver Burkeman speaking a lot about integrity and the use of time and so forth. So basically we were trying to get to the spirit of, let's really get to the heart of what matters and build our life around it. And, there was lots of critical feedback, as there always is, but by and large, I feel we fulfilled our mission to try and create a new festival that's worth having, that's different, that's distinct, that can be an annual feature, that something we can be proud of. And so it was the first year, but as one of the main initiators, I was fulfilled, I guess. I felt glad. And then I got COVID and was knocked out for 48 hours.
But that's just your God-given Sabbath, your period of rest.
I guess so, yeah.
But I'm just reflecting, how what a changed situation we're in. I was talking to our local chemist the other day, just before I came down to you, and there's nobody in the shop, so I had a chance to talk to him. And I said, you folks did well keeping the show open throughout COVID. I said, how was it for you? And he says, well, it got better, he said, but it was really tough in the early stages when we just did not know the full nature of the beast we were dealing with.
Right, right.
And you could feel that, you know, when you go into that chemist shop, it's just around the corner here on Craigton Road, which is, you know, a very hard-pressed, shall we put it like that, street in Govan here.
Right.
You could feel the tenseness and the stuff in those early days of COVID. Before you could get masks, you could. There was a sense of fear, and yet, you know, there they were, the pharmacists and the cashier assistants and so on, just faithfully working away and understanding the importance of staying faithful to their posts, even though some of the stories coming out of China and Italy, especially at that stage, were terrifying. And you know, that first wave of COVID, before it seemed to become a bit more gentle, was a devastating thing. And of course, these folk, being pharmacists, they knew full well that what was it? Oh dear, I've got it in one of my books, in Hell and High Water. One of the earlier waves of these viruses back around, was it around 2004, something like that. It killed something like very roughly half of the people it infected before they managed to stamp it out. These viruses can be incredibly lethal. This paper I'm reading on the plagues just now is saying, you know, with many of these plagues, by the time you got symptoms, it was too late. Just speaking, you were gonna, and they killed very quickly, some of them.
Yeah, gosh.
So folks on the front line, whether in the local pharmacy or the local shop, you know, Mohammed, our local shopkeeper, or Wahid, who runs, oh, wait a minute, my internet froze up for a moment. You know, local shopkeepers, Mohammed, the local grocery, Wahid and Khalid in the post office, these kind of people, you know, they were at their stations. And then even when the masks came out, you then had the whole, you know, anti-vax, anti-mask brigade happily sailing about, putting people like them at risk. Which I found a very sickening dynamic in terms of the way conspiracy theories played out. Incidentally, I see that Bill Gates tweeted out today about vaccines and so on, saying, you know, that the problem is, folks, we've run out of microchips.
I heard it. Yeah, I heard he was joking. Yeah. So he was playing off those conspiracy theories, but Well, listen, the other thing
it was trolling. I call it trolling the trolls.
Trolling the trolls. Yeah. Should be a word for that, like meta trolling or something. But
meta troll. Yeah, I think you've invented it.
Yeah, but the other thing that I really wanted to share after the festival with you, Alistair, is I realized that you're actually you're not just as a sort of friend and an inspirational sort of thinker, but you represent something quite important to me, because I've realized my sort of internal struggle over the last few years is, as you know, the roots of Perspectiva were a lot of public work on climate change and then a big public project on spirituality at almost the same time, and then a kind of realization they were effectively the same thing.
The one was the RSA.
Yeah.
And the Society of Arts,
yeah. So that was going back now. The new agenda on climate change report came out in 2013, and the spirituality work was published a little bit later, but around 2014, 2015. And then I began to realize that that if you look deeply enough, the problems are spiritual, but, and this is kind of crucial, a lot of the people who feel that already are not particularly political. You know, a lot of but by political, I don't mean party political. I mean interested in sort of systems and structures and power and movements, the ways of the world. And you know, just to give a little more context here, there are other people who are very learned and have a lot to say about God, but they are not community building and advancing change in a sort of activist way that you are. And then there are quite a lot of activists, but there's not that many of them who have the sort of religious and spiritual depth that you offer. And it's quite healthy for me to see somebody who manages to hold those things together, because I don't think there are that many. I know there are some historic figures, and we can mention many. There's Gandhi is an obvious one, Martin Luther King, maybe more recently forget the guy who was based in Schumacher College originally, but his mind will come.
Satish Kumar.
Satish Kumar, of course, comes to mind. And then there are various others. There are some, but I find those there are many people who feel ultimately we have to surrender because God is sort of in charge somehow, some version of that story, and others who don't really have a presence of there being anything else, any other force in play, and feel it's all up to us and feel the enormous weight and guilt of that. And finding the sweet spot in the middle that you seem to have found is, and embody, because I feel I've been talking about it, but I don't know if I really inwardly feel it yet.
Well, it's second temptation of Christ dynamic. So the ordering of the temptations varies in the Gospels, but in Luke's Gospel, which I use for convenience, the first temptation was to turn the stones into bread, to short circuit the powers of nature.
Right.
The temptation of inflation, to use magic, trickery, to fix your way out of a situation at the behest of your own will, as distinct from resting back into divine providence.
Right.
So that's the first temptation.
Right.
And the third temptation in Luke's ordering is to jump off from the high place or the pinnacle of the temple.
Right.
To put God to the test. In other words, to make a big spiritual show of power. Jump off from here and God will send God's angels to come and catch you, kind of stuff. Very spectacular. That's a temptation of the abuse of spiritual power, which is actually the deepest temptation of all. But what you're talking about here is the second temptation, where the devil says, if you will but kiss my ass, all of these kingdoms can be yours, to which Jesus replies to Pilate in John's Gospel during his trial before his execution. Pilate says, so I hear that you are a king then. And Jesus gives a very interesting and underestimated reply. He says, king is your word.
Right.
In other words, kingly power is your construct, that patriarchal, hierarchical type of power. That is your trip. And then he follows it up by saying, if my kingdom, or as I translated it, if my community was of this world, my followers would take up the sword and come to save me. But my kingdom, my community is not of this world. Why not? Because, as in the Lord's Prayer, which I used during my presentation, just to freak everybody out, it is not my kingdom come, it is thine kingdom come, thine opening of the way, thine flow of the Dharma be done in earth as is in heaven. So to me, what is going on here in terms of the politics of all of this is that, as Jesus once said, be as gentle as doves, but as switched on as vipers.
Yeah.
I think the word used was cunning, but that comes over with the wrong. That translation comes over with the wrong spin, I feel.
Sure.
As switched on as vipers, because of course a snake is considered in mythology to be very intelligent.
Yeah.
And so the name of the game in terms of spiritual politics, in terms of spiritual activism, is to be able to fully understand the political game and how it gets played, but to do so from a place of groundedness where it does not inflate your ego. And you're able to stand back a bit from it, but perhaps shape things from behind. And that is what I call a bardic politics.
Oh.
The politics in the bardic tradition is that the bard, the bard who in Highland Scottish society enjoyed a kind of diplomatic immunity and could move across clans. The bard's function was not to take on the role of the chief. It was not to take on a military function. The bard's function was to advise the chief and other influential people, and indeed the peoples themselves, as to the callings of peoplehood. Right. And, you know, in a very parallel situation of the book, I cited in Soil and Soul, I've forgotten its title just now, but there's a wonderful book by two authors in which they compare the bardic function in Celtic and African societies. Mm-hmm. And in both cases, the bard's role is to speak truth to power. Mm-hmm. And that the worst thing that can happen to a bard is that they lie. And if a bard lies, if a bard, in other words, abuses spiritual power, their face will come out in blotches. And they might even die, which, Jonathan, I say to you with much anguish, given that both of us have COVID at the moment.
So I think I liked when you said early on that you said there was a Hebridean line about if I'm spared. You
if we're spared.
If we're spared, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I forget what the context was, but I quite like that.
Well, it's just, you know, that's what the old folks of the Hebrides and the West Highlands of Scotland say. The old Presbyterian peoples, certainly, probably the Catholic ones too, it's probably older than that, but certainly the old Presbyterians that I was raised by. And they'll have this saying, the last person I heard it from in a joking apart situation was when I was asked to give the keynote at the 20th anniversary of the Ascent Crofters Trust. When was that? 1992. Oh no, must have been 25th anniversary, 2017, of the Ascent Crofters Trust. And they asked me to give the keynote address. And John Mackenzie, the crofter and very conservative Presbyterian, so conservative, he left the Free Church or the Free Presbyterians and is part of one of the breakaway groups, but a key figure in that community. And John Mackenzie, when I spoke to him the day before giving the keynote, said to me, you know, and we will see you tomorrow if we're spared. Meaning if God doesn't if God doesn't unplug you beforehand. And I mean, I just love it. I kind of make a joke of it, you see, but it's deeper than a joke, because what's actually going on there when you unpack it is a profound resting of one another's lives into the hands of providence.
Sure.
You see, and on the one hand, it sounds totally macabre, if we're spared, as if God is going to zap. Oh, my poor cat. I just nearly zapped the poor cat. Forgive me when I just reassure her that it's okay, sweetheart, you are being well spared. But there's also what's really going on when you look at it compassionately, which is what you've got to do with these things. What these people are constantly reminding of in that, because that, you know, growing up, I would regularly hear that, is that we're held in hands greater than our own. It's a very beautiful expression when you think of it.
There's also,
I might use that in the thought for the day on Monday. Carry on, sorry.
There you go. Well, there's also the old "there but for the grace of God go I," right? That's a kind of more familiar version of that, which my mum used to say to me sometimes, even though she wasn't particularly religious. There but for the grace of God go I. I mean, but it's not as funny as if we're spared.
It's. I mean, when I go down to the post office and it's Pakistani Scots running it, you know, I'll often say to Wahid or Zahid or Khalida there, I'll say, you know, Inshallah, if it is the will of Allah.
Sure.
And of course, I do that very deliberately because they know that I'm Christian.
Yeah.
And they know I'm not Muslim. They probably get, well, actually, in this, it's strange, but in, you know, in Scottish working class communities, there seems to be quite a lot of respect for these folks. I don't think they do get much racism.
Right.
And certainly Patrick, the son of Mohammed in our local grocery, when I say to him, do you get racism in the shop here? He said, no. He says, no. And I know him well enough that he would tell me if he did, which is very interesting. But, oh my goodness, can you hear my throat starting to go a bit?
Yes. The thing about COVID is it's very bumpy. You think you're over it.
I'm going to have to up the medication if this carries on. If we're spared. And you see what it does, inshallah, or simply just putting your hand on your heart like that when you go into the shop, is it's just such a lovely way of saying, I recognize you and you're all right, and thank you for serving the community.
Right.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
And that's how, you know, that's just how you do race relations.
Yeah, no.
It's as simple as that.
That much I can see. There's a couple of things I want to come back to just to double down on them a little bit because they're so profound. But the first that's coming to mind is when you said earlier about speaking to people in such a way, or listening to people in such a way, might be more accurate to say listening, such that they can find their own archetypal quality. It was something like that. I couldn't quite get to the nub of what you were saying, but it's as if there are archetypal energies kind of out there in some capacity, psychically, intersubjectively, culturally. They're there as part of the shared symbolic world that we're part of, a narrative world. But there's something about listening to someone and speaking to them in a way that they find an archetypal expression of where they are, that you say is somehow energizing or empowering. Have I got that right? You were trying to get
not quite, because I think we're talking about two things here.
Right.
I think in terms of opening channels for the flow of archetypal energy. By archetypal energy here, that's basically a fancy way of saying meaning, patterns of meaning.
Okay. Would you say that? Okay.
Okay, that's what I would say. But I think what you're getting at here is a slightly different thing, which is recognizing that of God and all, as weak Wakers would put it. Looking at every human face. I can't remember if I said this or not during the talk at the festival, but you're looking around the room and looking at everybody and just thinking to yourself, you know, there's a soul, there's another soul,
right.
Another soul, and recognizing that in each of these, even if you don't feel drawn to them or you actively dislike them for some reason, nevertheless, there's another face of God in the room.
Mm.
And that when you come to people, when people come to you and you respond to them, seeking, no, my use of the word seeking, to ground yourself in a place where you can be receptive of that in them, then sometimes, quite often, a deeper magic opens up. People feel it. You see, that was, if I might go back to it, in the two brief interactions that I had with Nick, the host, that was what happened. Because, I mean, I will tell you something honestly, and I may have mentioned it to him, I can't quite remember. But the day before I came to you, I said to my hosts in Exeter that I was apprehensive about coming to your event. Because I got the sense it was going to be full of the beautiful people, in the sense of privilege, in a highly privileged context. And I was feeling apprehensive about why I had been invited to this and what I could say that might draw things into a space that gives life. And I was doubly apprehensive because I recognized I was feeling that apprehension. And as my host in Exeter said, what is her name? Sue Llewellyn, I think it was, a psychologist. who Tim Gorringe had accommodated me with, she, drew attention to highlight my prejudice, my prejudice, my prejudging in what I was coming into. So when I arrived, on the 2-hour train journey there, it had been going through my mind, I must try and remember to remove my Scottish filters about English landowners in this kind of context, and try to honor these people as souls. That's what was going on in me, Jonathan.
Right.
That was part of that creative potential that was going on in there. And there was a counter voice saying, yeah, but don't go too far, because at the same time, part of your role is to have a critical edge in these things.
Yeah.
Because you know how easy it is to be invited up to the big house and given a bit of fishing or shooting, or or the banquet or whatever it is, and you get sucked into that and you lose your critical edge. So for me, coming into that context, I was balancing up would suggest too much control over the process, discerning, and I would really have to say, trying to hold in a place of, I would be forced reluctantly to use the word prayer, to hold in a place of prayer the context I was coming into.
Mm.
A bit like in the early days when I first started doing talks to the military, before I kind of got used to it, interestingly. But in the early days, I would wrestle with it for days beforehand. As a pacifist coming in to speak to very senior military about nonviolence.
Sure.
And that was how I handled it then. And the point is, Jonathan, that when you manage to come from that place, they will pick up the tension, but they will also see how you're addressing it.
Right.
And in my experience, without exception, they honor that.
Right.
I think that's what happened with Nick and me.
Yeah.
There was an honoring of that. And that's what came out in that closing session, from what I understand.
Yeah. And also, we are in 2022, and a lot of the things we've been cultured to have hang-ups about don't feel as relevant anymore. Like, for example, the freedom with which we speak of God now, even 10 years ago, would have, Elizabeth speaks about the G-bomb as a funny way of saying, I'm going to drop the G-bomb, God's in the room. When she said it back in 2011, I think it was, it was really funny. It was really funny because it was so true. And I was even trying to do this spirituality project, dancing around the word, saying, no, we're not talking about religion, we're not doing God, we're just doing spirituality. It's okay, you're safe,
Yeah.
And of course that was ridiculous, because who understands the spiritual world more than in many thousands of years of religious learning? Yeah. And yet now I find people are just much less threatened by the idea that we might speak of something non-material, divine, celestial, transcendent, whatever, partly because the world as it is seems so inadequate. The world as it is so in turmoil and unable to solve its own problems, that people are just much less inclined to think it's a bounded situation. And then with issues of class and privilege, people are aware the world's radically unfair. So on the one hand, you've got aristocracy and land that comes down through the generations. But then you've also got, Bill Gates, you mentioned, but you've got Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and forms of surveillance capitalism with a small number of people getting billions, while many others are going to food banks and struggling to live. So it's as if the old prejudices, which were within this relatively safe, boundaried world, are not felt so keenly anymore. It's like they're still there, we're aware of them, but everyone's so disillusioned, or let's say troubled by the general state of the world, particularly our inability to grasp ecological collapse, sense of political implosion in lots of ways, that they're much more forgiving of these apparent taboos, whether they're sex, religion, or anything else.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you know, on the God question, I mean, I cracked the joke during my session there about in my parents' generation, you could talk about God, but not about sex. And now you can talk about sex, but not about God.
Yeah.
And of course, people laugh. But you know what? Even as I cracked it, Jonathan, I thought to myself, that joke is starting to wear out.
Half its half-life, yeah. Yeah, I agree.
It's actually starting to go the other way now.
It's funny, yeah. Right. So,
but the other dynamic, in terms of these aristocratic power, just moneyed power dynamics, is that one of the several curious one-to-one side talks, which because of my deafness and the need to use these microphones. Where am I? Oh, here we are. Yeah, see, I'm listening to you through this one of my microphones plugged in. Here that plays directly into my hearing, because as you saw, I have to go around, holding this up to people as if I'm interviewing them, and you got that flashing light, and oh my goodness, I hate having to do it, but there we are. But it militates towards one-to-one rather than group stuff. And so on the second night of the festival, when the concert was on, one of the participants came up to me, and I didn't know who he was, but he was keen to have a talk. So we went through to the one of the quiet places and had a beer together and got talking. And he started quizzing me about landed power, and I told him honestly what I thought. And he said, so if you were advising Nick as to what he could do with this place here, what would you say?
This is probably Ed. Was he a tall guy with blonde hair?
I'm not saying who it was.
Okay.
I didn't know who it was.
Right.
And I was just,
Sure.
So I named a number of things just from, literally just from the sense I had of what the Shaftesbury estates hold, from uncorroborated sources like Wikipedia, which is all I'd had a chance to look at. And I was saying, well, you could do this, you could do that, you could do that, And I said to him, but I don't feel a calling for me to say that to Nick or
Dina.
Dina.
Yeah.
Dina. Got to remember the H on the end. I don't feel a calling to say that to them. It just doesn't feel that is what I am here to be doing. But that's what I would say. Whereupon he said, well, actually, I'm one of the trustees of the estate. And I thought, well, there you go. That's how it works. I was taking my books are upstairs just now, but I'd been reading the Richard Wilhelm translation of the Tao Te Ching.
Oh wow!
The Chinese classic.
Yeah.
And the Tao Te Ching or Tao Te Ching, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's all about no push. It's about the watercourse way.
Yeah.
It's about settling into the Tao, into the Dharma, into the God space, and holding that space, what Parker Palmer calls spaces hospitable to the soul. Then the right things happen. And I thought, well, there you go, McIntosh, Had I gone in and said, here's my chance to have a go at the Earl of Shaftesbury and tell him what he can be learning from Scotland. And instead, I've not done that, although I gave him a copy of Soil and Soul, inscribed with that Alice Walker quote after we got talking. But I've not done that. But instead, one of his relatives is having this conversation with me. And it's not me been pushing it, but the relative has asked me for it. So if there is any traction potentially in what I've said, I know that that'll find its way back.
Right.
Whether that is applicable traction is beyond my calling, my remit to determine. I can only play the role that I discern that I'm called to play in that particular kairos moment.
Sure.
It's a trip, isn't it?
It
So
is.
these are the kind, I mean, I'm just describing to you, Jonathan, and we've been talking about the conversations that we've had, but you had what, 60, 70 people at that event?
About 80 in total, yeah.
80 was it?
Yeah.
You had 80 people at that event. And so, you know, hopefully there were a lot of cross currents
Yeah.
going on. And, you know, it plays out in funny ways. Like when I do Thought for the Day on Radio Scotland this coming Monday, and I'm going to be looking at COVID,
Yeah.
my emphasis is going to be on what it means to be a care society.
Right. Right.
And, you know, part of that, when I think back to it, is vibing in was Madeline's important talk, I felt.
Really important. Yeah.
I felt that that was an important talk. And I understood it all the more since my mother was in a care home during the COVID era.
Right.
We managed to get her into actually a Jewish run care home up the road from here, beautifully held space.
Wow.
We're not Jews, obviously, but it was a Jewish held care home. And what Madeline was saying about care and the people who carry it, and what those poor care workers were carrying during COVID, that, you know, they had to cut off their social lives. This particular care home was hard hit in the early stages of COVID. This is why, you know, must take it seriously. They lost a third of their patients. My mother was only able to get in at zero notice,
right,
because they had, when my mother had a brain hemorrhage, she fell and had a brain hemorrhage, which was unsuccessfully operated on.
Right.
She was only able to get in at immediate notice because other people had died.
Right.
That's what COVID was like in the early stages.
Yeah.
And the staff were deeply traumatized by it. And yet, Jonathan, they held their posts.
Right.
And you know, there's really a day goes by, and I've not been back up to the care home since she died because it was COVID. You can't just drop in back up to the care home since my mother died because it was COVID. You can't just drop in like you used to be able to do. But you know, when I am able to, I just want to go back up and touch base with some of those carers
and thank them
who held us through a difficult death, a painful death at certain stages, and so on, and just thank them for, well, thank them again for the depth of what they were giving, and you know, most of them on just not very much above minimum wage.
Right.
You know, they were relatively well paid in that home, but carers, as Madeline was pointing out, most carers are lucky if they're getting minimum wage, and what's more, so many carers, they put in so much more than they're paid for. So
and Madeline's talk on care was striking for lots of reasons. Madeline Bunting, but one of the things that struck me most was her simple question of, you know, instead of asking someone how are you or what do you do, ask them who do you care for,
or what is your world.
What is your world? That was actually Damien. That was someone that was
but that was somebody else with it. Okay,
sort of expert with horses and so forth.
Thank you.
But Madeline's question was,
who do you care for? What do you care for?
And you could say who or what, but in some ways it's better to keep it more direct, because you know, there are some people who, you know, maybe live alone or have no particular caring responsibilities where the question would seem strange, but in some ways it's all the more powerful for that. It's who do you care for? And no, I'm touched to hear what you say, because she also spoke about the privilege idea, the different kind of privilege, right? Because they're not the privilege of wealth and aristocracy, but she said a lot of these carers who are paid virtually nothing, who do very difficult work, see people, you know, have to clean things up and carry people and bathe them and all that kind of stuff. And they still speak about their work being a privilege. And she was like, she wanted to probe that, and rightly so. And the word, I've written down the wordings, I won't get it quite right, but it was, when she asked them, the way they described it was the privilege to be trusted, the privilege to be trusted, to be a witness to a fellow human being at their most vulnerable. it was a combination of these things about trust, about witnessing, and about vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that this was somehow enlivening, like that actually to be in that position of trust, to care for someone vulnerable was sort of, of course, it's in some ways quite deeply Christian. That
it's going to be. I'm sorry, Johnson. Yeah, in some ways, quite deeply Christian. I was just having to get a cramp in my leg there. I had to move my friend.
Yeah, I don't think cats are particularly Christian, but anyway, I just mean in the sense that whatever you've done for the least of thee, you do it unto me.
You do it unto me.
Yeah,
it's so much that.
Yeah,
it's so much that, and I found, especially in the last few days when I was sleeping in the same room as my mother, because at that time, most of the time I had to visit her through the window from the outside, and they put her on a ground floor, which was really good of them, because she was brought down by ambulance from the Isle of Lewis, so that she'd be here, and so they took her in, and they had to put her into their quarantine unit for a fortnight, but then they let her just stay there because they didn't have other immediate pressure. And so I was able to visit her on the ground floor through the window, through a closed window, so it was literally waving to her through the window. But once she was deemed to be end of life, the regulations allowed me to come inside, having each time I went there done a lateral flow test. Yeah. So every visit entailed basically an extra 3/4 of an hour, because you had to have the test done by one of the nurses, and then you had to wait for about half an hour or something, whatever it was, to be sure it was negative. And so in the final days, I was in the room with her, only one person allowed. I was the relative who was living close by, was allowed in. And my goodness, it was like watching those carers. It was like watching, a whole lot of Florence Nightingales, some of them male as well, most of them female, tending to their work. You'd occasionally get one who didn't have quite such a good attitude, but then you thought, well, they've probably just had had it up to the eyes or something, something going on personally, or what have you. But generally there was a sense of this being spiritual work. And so when my mother did die, we obviously made a donation to the staff fund, as would be expected, but I also gave them a copy of Ram Dass's book. Ram Dass, the old...
Yeah, How Do I Help, maybe, or which one did you
Sorry?
give? How Do I Help? Was that the one?
That might be one of it. I mean, the one he's best known for, which I get, the old hippie classic.
Right.
Where is it? It's somewhere up in the round. Give me that.
Let me see that. That's
this ancient old hippie classic. Be here now. Be here now. Remember, be here now. And I mean, it's full of all these.
I think I have heard of this book.
Old,
I don't think
the gurus in India. Om mani padme hum. Turn on, tune in, drop out. See, but I mean, Ram Dass, when he was in his 60s, I think it was, he had this really bad stroke, and so at the height of all these kind of gurudom, he got totally wiped out by this terrible stroke, a lot of pain and all the rest of it. And then in a wonderful DVD called Fierce Grace, he talks about the fierce grace of being afflicted like that, how he was in a sense stroked by the stroke, how, if I might exaggerate slightly, those temptations to abuse spiritual power, to get caught up in spiritual power, humbled him into he was humbled into a whole deeper level, in which his fundamental mantra became, I am loving awareness.
Right.
I am loving awareness. You see? And his final teaching, although he could hardly speak, some of it was just quite the deepest spiritual stuff in terms of the spirituality of love, which is a true spirituality. So, you know, he's the book that came out just around the time he died is called Walking Each Other Home, beautifully produced book co-written with Mirabelle Bush. She basically drew it out of him. And Ram Dass did a lot of work with people who were dying or recently bereaved, a lot of hospice type work. Mm-hmm. So he's drawing upon that in terms of his spiritual dynamic. And basically he's written he's been helped to draw out a beautiful book of end life material. So I gave a copy of that to the carers in the hospice, and the beauty of it being that, you know, this is a Jewish owned charity care home, of which there's 2 in Glasgow. And what was Ram Dass as part of his Hinduism? He was born into a Jewish family. Ram Dass is Richard Alpert, the Harvard psychology lecturer, who got kicked out for tripping out. He's one of these Jewish prophets, basically. And so, you know, there was a great thing to be able to give to them.
That's curious. So just I missed a detail there. Ram Dass as a Jewish prophet, like as a sort of stealth Jewish prophet.
Oh, I mean, I would seem wholly so. I mean, if you go onto the Be Here Now podcast site, and you listen to his podcasts, listen to one like, you know, just take a title off the top of my head that was particularly powerful, Dharmic Fire, the fire of Dharma, the Dharmic Fire. Listen to that. And I mean, what you see coming through there is somebody who's deeply immersed in Hindu thought, in Vedic thought, in a very grounded, practical life way, very deep, mystical way, but is also deeply grounded in Hebrew tradition. Mm-hmm. So he'll trip over into some story about an old rabbi or or about Jewish mothers or sure. That kind of stuff. But also he loves the Christian tradition. Yeah. You know, he understands that Jesus was a latter-day Jewish prophet, basically, whose degree of individuation, whose degree of self-realization was such that he realized the God archetype. And there you have a very interesting point, because we started this conversation as to what were archetypes. And there's a wonderful Twitter site called Sophia Cycles, SOPHIACYCLES, Sophia Cycles. And it's run by a Catalan woman called Bea Gonzalez.
Oh, I think I follow that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you probably follow it. I think she lives in Canada. And she's all the time tweeting out stuff by or about Jung. And the other day she tweeted out one, which was saying, you know, the archetype is empty until it's realized. And I thought, you know, this is a strong theme in Jung, and it's something I've never understood. And one of the things I found, Jonathan, is that, you know, if people expect you to understand something, as people would expect me to understand something like that, but you openly declare, I don't actually understand it, you almost feel people giving a sigh of relief. They think, oh, if he doesn't understand it, that's okay. So I tweeted back to this one and saying, you know, can you explain that? I just never understood that principle of Jung's, that the archetype is empty
until it is realized.
Until it's realized. And somebody, another woman, very helpfully replied, suggesting that what Jung meant is that the archetype is transcendent. It is transcendent of form until it is realized it is incarnate in form. To which I said, so you mean the way in which God is empty of form. God is not this, not that. The Buddha nature is not this, not that of form, until realized
Right.
in the incarnation of a Christ or a Buddha or other Mahavatar, great avatar, great teacher figure, which of course is why Jesus has got two names.
Right.
Jesus, Christ.
Yeah.
Christ is not just, it's not like Christ is a surname, but it's like Jesus is the incarnate, the male who lived for 33 years and was executed because of his solidarity with the poor and the suffering and the oppressed and so on. Whereas Christ is the cosmic principle, the archetype, the God archetype, the Krishna archetype.
Right. And Jesus Christ is both.
Of eternity.
Right. Wow. Poof. Yeah. I mean, I sort of I grasp it insofar as I can.
You're forcing me to have a top up.
Well, I was just thinking.
Share with me, and I don't know if you're going to use this with anybody else, but share some further thoughts about your own take on the realization. Isn't that a beautiful sound?
Yeah, it is. The whiskey bottle top.
Of the Realisation Festival 2022, and where has it landed? Apart from having COVID, both having COVID, and hence a need for our medication. I hope you're doing okay with yours.
Cheers.
Lest we forget. Where does it leave you landed, Jonathan?
So I still have, I have a mixture of feelings. On the one hand, I have a certain amount of imposter syndrome, which means that when an event like that happens, and I find myself having a leading role in it, and I have people coming up to me to thank me for it and so forth, and of course, many others were involved. It was a big team effort. Still, there's a little bit of disbelief because I don't really know what I'm doing. I have a sort of nose for the kind of thing I want to see happen, and a feeling for what I want people to feel. As you know, I think Perspectiva's tagline is systems, souls, society, because I believe we live in, I'm coming back to the personal, I don't want to evade it with a concept, but I'm coming back there. I believe we live in three worlds. There's the sort of world of events and processes and objective reality that science deals with. That's the world of atoms and molecules, the objective world. There's the world of the inner life, thoughts and feelings and longings, that is subjective. And then there's the world of language and metaphor and image and institution and text, that is a shared world, the intersubjective or interobjective world. Now, why do I mention that? Because I feel insofar as I have a calling, a professional calling, it's to insist on this sort of equal and interrelated reality of these three things. And if you push me, God's existence in all of these things. Now, why does that matter? Because it's been strenuous, Alistair, if I'm honest. It's a strenuous load to carry in the sense that I believe it to be true, but I've yet to meet many people who want to live in all three worlds. I think we do live in all three worlds, but I think getting the conversation there, so you don't just chill out and talk about, the soul, of course, is always the greatest entertainment, the greatest enchantment. And there's a lot of gossip in the social world and a lot of interesting facts in the scientific world. But getting people to sort of sit with the tension of those three things together, I feel that's my life's work. And it's not easy work to carry.
Let me just get something for a moment. So, Oh no, it's not in here. What I was looking for is Spiritual Activism, the book that it was Matt Carmichael. Jonathan Porritt gave it a blurb with its clarion call that spirituality is central to activism. This is truly a book for our age, challenging the preconception of most activists, let alone those who still see spirituality solely as an inner journey. Now, in Resurgence, Jonathan very generously named that his book of the year. And the specific reason why is that he said that in the Green debate, you have the sort of politicals who are into the politics of it, but not the spirituality. Yeah. And then you have the spiritual wing who are into the spirituality of it, but not the politics. Yeah. And as you were saying earlier, very seldom do those two come together. Yeah. Now, Jonathan gets it. I mean, I first met Jonathan in the 1990s. We don't agree on everything, but we agree on most things. And he really gets it.
This is Jonathan Porritt, right?
Jonathan Porritt, yeah. Jonathan Porritt. And came to public prominence as director of Friends of the Earth in the 1990s or thereabouts. And now runs Forum for the Future. And Jonathan is a genuinely humble man. He, Sir Jonathan Porritt, but he doesn't play up that kind of dynamic. He lives down the status that he's got. He really sees a need for the spiritual and the political to come together. Yeah. At the same time, I mean, one of the things that I would say to him, I probably have said to him, is I'd love to see him bringing that forward more in his work. And I think, and this is an interesting point, because both you and I are Scottish, albeit in my case, I was born in Doncaster of an English mother, and from the age of 4, with a Scottish father raised on the Isle of Lewis. Important to acknowledge that bridging but fundamentally Scottish culturally and 50% ancestrally. Goodness, I needed that medication. What I find really interesting, Jonathan, is that it is very much easier for us as Scots to talk about the spiritual than it is for English folk, and especially for the French. So my wife is French, and every time I speak in France, and I'm talking about speaking to corporations, I'm talking about speaking to the French military, I'm talking about my French relatives, that kind, and French greens, village green groups and so on. And I'll invariably get the same thing. At the end, people will come up and say, that's wonderful what you're saying about spirituality, but we couldn't, you can talk like that because you're Scottish. We can't because we're French. And I get the same sense in England. That is there's a kind of cringe thing in England about it. Right. And we can do that from Scotland, but we need to spread that. We need to, that needs to be bust through. It needs to be opened out.
So I have,
so people get stuck.
Just that I mean, it's interesting to hear that, and curious to probe it in terms of cultural, comfort with things, and terminology, of course, is part of that. What words tacitly mean in different places. But what I also wanted to add was, for a while, I used to speak in terms of the spiritual and the political, even in terms of power and love. There's a famous Tillich, saying that Martin Luther King later used that you know about. But I found that speaking of the spiritual and the political wasn't getting me anywhere really. At least, like, I had a piece in Prospect magazine once where I spoke about politics has to become more spiritual. And some were kind of vaguely interested, but didn't get anywhere. But here's the thing I think is going on there is, the reason I speak of 3 worlds and not 2, and it's not just me, the roots of this go back to Karl Popper's lecture on the 3 worlds, to Habermas's various theories.
I don't know the lecture you mean, so
okay, I can share something with it later. But Karl Popper spoke of living in world 1, world 2, and world 3 that more or less corresponds to what I'm saying. It was his attempt to get out of the dualist debate to solve the mind-body problem. He was trying to explain that a lot of the confusion occurs because we actually live in 3 worlds that are that is the the least number you can reduce things to. And of course, this is very interesting spiritually, because many of religious traditions come down to three main forms of things. The Trinity, of course, and then the Godhead in Hinduism and various other sources. And then you've got the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who speaks about oneness, two-ness, and threeness. But that's all footnotes. The point is, I really believe we live in three worlds. I'm not just saying it as some kind of affectation. I really believe that this is the lowest level to which you can distill reality, that there are these three distinct things. They have different kinds of reality, they're known in different ways, and they're valued in different ways. So different ontologies, epistemologies, axiologies. And it's not just me. This is coming from many different philosophical sources. Karl Popper is one, Jürgen Habermas is another, Ken Wilber is another, and then there are many other sources. And then, of course, it's intimated by these different religious traditions as well. Why do I mention that? Because I think it's a way to ground the challenge that we're speaking of bringing the spiritual and the political together. Because if you just say spiritual and political, the risk is it looks a bit synthetic. These terms come out of kind of thin air. But I think if you say, look, we really live in three worlds, and you can see it in your own experience, then you build up from there. That within the soul, there is already the system and the society. Within the system, it gives rise to the soul and the society. Society contains soul and system. And you begin to see it's ultimately one world. And it's a world that's changing, but it's changing in these three different ways all the time. And that matters because the soul aspect of it, the subjective aspect of it, is equally real with the others. It's fundamental. It doesn't mean that there aren't stars and galaxies and atoms and molecules. They're just as real. It doesn't mean there aren't cultural forms and institutions and laws and texts. They're also real. They have their own kind of reality, and they're irreducible to each other. And I think that matters when it comes to speaking of the soul. Now, the reason I mentioned that is, when I come to a festival like that, that's the burden I carry, the cross I bear in a sense. It's a strong feeling that I want people to live in each of these worlds, to see that they're equally important, and that to live fully, somehow all of them have to be alive. And I think the festival got some way towards that, but there's some way to go.
Well, I think there was a lot of intellectual energy at the festival. And there was, there were one or two points when in terms of fire, air, earth, water balance. I was kind of thinking to myself, there's a bit too much air in this room, not enough to keep the COVID at bay. But
No, you said, and I like that.
A lot of that, highly communicative, intellectual energy, which was part of the joy of the event. But also, I could sense a dryness at times in there. How do you counterpoint that? Fire, air, I think there was a fair bit of fire there at the weekend. Earth, the place gave that, albeit in an aristocratic context. So it wasn't like doing something in the Galgale Trust down the road here in Govan, where you'd have earth in a very deeply grounded, hard-pressed community context. You're doing earth there in a sense that you brought back a sense of the romanticist sublime, in a sense that is not something that is able to be widely replicated in a world of 8 billion people. And then water, the emotionality. Now, there, by virtue of my deafness, I can't hear music properly any longer. So I don't go to music events. That's why I'm on my own tonight, because my wife's away at the Solus Festival over in Perthshire. And I just unless I'm invited as a speaker, I don't go to these things because too noisy. And but unless the water, that emotional element was strongly there in the music sessions, and I don't know, then maybe that's what you need more of. Maybe the storytelling, and by storytelling I don't mean necessarily made up stories. I mean more weaving a sense of storytelling, a sense of magic, a sense of fairy from everyday life, so that you bring depths of meaning into it, that kind of bardic dynamic.
Well, yeah, well, look, yes, I agree. And I want to hear that fully and not defensively, reinterpret it. I think you're right. I think it's important to make sure that the water element, as you put it, the emotions, are balanced with the others. I never really thought of it that way. It's fascinating to think of. I mean, first of all, obviously the Realisation Festival is just one thing that Perspectiva does. It's a relatively small part of our work. On the other hand, it's quite a big feature event.
I can see that psychically it's big for you, yes.
It is. It matters a lot because it carries a lot with it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting vis-a-vis those elements is two things. One is, if I understand you correctly, the water element is the sort of emotionality, the feeling of the event. The fire element is the passion and the sort of the maturing of it, the aliveness of it.
Yeah.
The air element you would call the sort of intellectual element, I think. And the earth element is kind of the groundedness in the place and the nourishment, I think, of the place. What's interesting here, Alistair, is two things. So first of all, that's fascinating to think of any event like that, even a dinner party like that. It's very interesting. But what I'm also touched by is my wife is Indian, as you know, Shiva, and my mother-in-law, Vatsala, is a chemist by background. And she's always very troubled whenever I speak of the elements, because for her, there are 5 elements, not 4. And she thinks the Western world is really screwed up in thinking of only 4 elements, because they have this term in Sanskrit called akash, which literally translates as sky, but actually functions as a kind of space. So they would say that if you have a glass like this, in there you've got water, you've obviously got earth, and there's some air here. There's no fire at the moment, apart from maybe the light. But she also has a notion of kind of space, as in the kind of what the air and the water are currently in is the space element. And I'm like, well, it's a bit intangible. We don't really recognize that. But for her, it's real, and it manifests in lots of different ways. And the reason, and this is a way beyond the question you asked me, but if you'll forgive me, I began to think at one point, how the Eastern traditions believe in reincarnation and we don't, or at least in the Western world, we struggle with the idea a bit. I began to think this might be something to do with the kind of folk ontology of 5 elements instead of 4, because it's a bit of a stretch, but bear with me. There's something about that idea of where the soul is between lives, right? There's something about we in the West have a sort of little struggle with this idea that it's somehow, and again, I'm speaking here in a unguarded way, but the soul somehow comes out of the body in its immaterial form, so that's mysterious already, and gradually finds its way, having lost its memory, into a newborn in some way, and life goes on. But the question of where it's held in that time, metaphysically, cosmologically, we struggle to conceive of that. I think we don't have the mental apparatus to picture what that in-between state is. And I think that's partly because we don't have this 5th element of akash or space. Because I think if the souls do transmigrate, I think there's the interim space, whether it's Bardo or whatever else, is space-like in its nature, not air-like, not water-like, not earth-like, not like fire-like. And I think that's why we struggle to find our way into reincarnation as a notion. Whereas for many of them, it's just self-evident.
Well, when you think of how critics of the sense of a transcendent good will often dismiss it as being belief in a sky god.
Right.
In a way, you could turn that around and say, great, take that as a compliment.
Sky, yeah, because sky is space, right?
Yeah, because when you were saying the 5 elements, of which sky is the 5th, just before you said that, I was thinking the limitation of fire, air, earth, water is that there's something very earthbound about that formulation.
Right.
Whereas the real magic happens when the transcendent breaks through those.
Yeah.
In a way that you see so beautifully expressed in T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. When it's, you know, towards the end there, when the rose of love basically explodes with fire, tongues of fire transcendent. It's upstairs just now. I can't read it to you just now, but you probably know what I mean. And to me, you know, what I was doing in that opening talk there is I was just being receptive to that 5th element coming in, that transfiguring element, because we are talking about transfiguration.
Yeah.
To transfigure is to take a limited worldly situation and to re-perceive it, or to allow it to relive in a transcendent context, so that the immanent and the transcendent come together. Thy kingdom, thy community come on earth as is in heaven, that union of the transcendent function and the grounded function. And then we're tripping. Then, for me, this is when we start getting into the elements that drive social change.
Right.
So when people say to me, you know, how come you're able to do with what you did was land reform or stopping the super quarry, or your colleagues in the Gall Gale, how do you do it? And I'll say, well, you know, if I might whisper it, not too publicly, we are honoring the divine. We're honoring that calling. With Gall Gale, Iona has played an important part right from the beginning. By Iona, I mean simply folk from Gall Gale going up to Iona, experiencing the ancient stones in the abbey there, the ancient carved stones, just experiencing stuff, experiencing the nature of the island. On occasions when I have funding to take a group of Gall Gale to Iona, which I like to do every year if I can, taking about 20 or so folk up there, they experience it just in the nature of the place itself and the little one-to-ones that happen. What happens is that the divine breaks through. Now, how does that show? It shows, like, you know, 3 years after one of those trips, a guy comes up to me in our workshop. I'm talking about a mile down the road here in Govan from where I was speaking to you. And he says to me, you know, I don't think I ever told you, Alistair, but when we went down to St. Columba's Bay that day, I just went and sat alone on a rock for some time. And I have never felt such peace in my whole life as I felt then. But the wonderful thing is that since I came back from Iona, occasionally I'll feel that peace coming on me again. There you see it. Now, Jonathan, that's the kind of thing that makes the difference between somebody rising into life and somebody deciding to take their own life, whether overtly or, as usually happens around here, indirectly through a drugs overdose, so it doesn't actually get counted as suicide, but actually it is. At the risk of irreverence, I'm tempted to say it's trippy stuff. It is trippy stuff. You know, it trips folks out into a different reality. It trips folks who are living in hard-pressed, poverty-ridden. I'm sitting here talking to you. I'm looking out at, I don't know if you can see that.
Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, basically you're looking onto social housing there. We're in a row of private houses in a hard-pressed
governance,
area.
of course,
But
and
in Govan, yes.
yeah.
Just off Craigton, Lost Road, which is just off Craigton Road, which is a really hard-pressed street. There were 10 derelict houses in that street when we moved in. And, you know, as I'm sitting here, I'm looking at you on the screen there, but I'm also got an eye out the window. And I'm seeing, you know, sometimes what I can only describe as shuffling poverty, shuffling past.
Right.
The rich do not understand how much the privilege that they have held unto themselves and that they have voted for with the kind of government that controls the UK just now, they do not understand how much it screws the poor.
Right.
They do not understand because poverty is a very silent thing.
Right.
Poverty drains energy. Poverty is a stripping away of options in life. You're talking about a situation that when we moved here, you know, and I've not looked just recently, but this area had 5 times the national average of drug admissions to hospital and 7 times the national average of alcohol admissions.
Right.
And when you get to know these folks, because, you know, the middle class view is it's because of fecklessness, you know, how, if they're on benefits, how can they afford to buy that alcohol and all the rest of it? When you get to know them, it's because of contracted life circumstances.
Right.
And when you're born into, and when you're intergenerationally born into contracted life circumstances, it breeds that kind of culture. And you know, that is why the grounding, the earth element, so much needs to be not just in situations of privilege, like when I speak in a military college, or when I speak to a corporation, or at our Realisation Festival 2022, but also needs to have this connection with where the suffering is.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree.
And you see, Jonathan, this is where the spirituality becomes so important, because how do you handle that without being overwhelmed?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one way I handle it is I remind myself, you know, I'm not God. I'm here to do a little bit of the service that I might be called to by God, if I can put it like that. Even that sounds a bit grandiose. I'm here to listen and to pay attention, to accompany folk, to be present with people, but not to kid myself on that I've got the fix for what's out there.
Yeah.
You see, our role, as George Fox of the Quakers put it, is simply patterns and examples. Do these little things. That's why I use the rice pudding example, even if I screwed up the quantity of rice that I gave in my directions. I couldn't quite remember in the moment. I underestimated by at least half. But, you know, rice pudding, you know, you're having a community gathering, make a big rice pudding. It's very cheap. It won't cost you anything.
Yeah.
People love it. Or go, I mean, I've got a friendly fishmonger in Waitrose, and if I go at a particular time and he's got stuff left over, he'll pile it into a bag with no charge on it, which really? I then drop into Gal Gale.
Oh wow!
And
okay.
You see, or I'll make into a fish pie or something like that and take down to one of our Thursday evening things.
Right.
Of course, that is, you know, crumbs off the rich man's table. That is the charity dynamic, but it's all these little things that set a tenor that is basically saying, take your reference points, not from the rich and powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Take your reference points from the shuffling poor that shuffle past that window. And I mean no exaggeration when I say shuffling poor. Because so many of the poor actually have mobility issues.
Right.
And you literally, you know, I sit here talking to you with one eye and the other eye on the window, seeing people passing by, and you can just see poverty in the way they walk, even if you can't see faces.
Right. Gosh,